Hello, fellow leaders. My name is Prasad Vadlamani, and I'm your host of the Indian Leadership Podcast. I'm delighted to welcome you to a thought provoking leadership talk with Shankar Kalyana, who grew up in India watching Hollywood matinee idols, wanted to study astrophysics, but ended up at a job as a computer programmer. He felt and still feels that computer programming is a universal language that everyone can understand. He chose to come to the USA because it's this country where technologies are either invented or matured. He spoke fondly about his mentors who patiently taught him introductory lessons to computers, the bootcamp style education he received at his first job, and about his early days in the US, how both fellow Indian and American communities embraced him where he learned to adjust to a new culture and country. Shankar is a technical genius who has keen business insights. Don't miss this talk as he speaks a lot about mentorship, inspiring teams through your behavior, and leading by example. Enjoy the show. Welcome to Indian Leadership Podcast. Today we have a great guest. His name is Shankar Kalyana. He is an IBM fellow where he drives digital transformation at scale. He has 36 plus years of experience in information technology, 21 plus years at IBM. He has a Bachelor's of Science in Math and Physics from Madura College in India and MS in Information Science from Pennsylvania State University. Welcome, Shankar.
Hello, Prasad. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Please tell us, we know the format we discussed. This is about our growing up in India, your immigrant experiences, career here, and, life in US, right? But
yeah,
the majority of it is leadership, right? So to begin with, let's talk about your childhood, growing up in India, and who influenced you as a kid.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm actually glad to share some of my experiences because, interestingly, if someone had seen me, when I was a kid, they probably would not have predicted the and correlated the fact that I'm an IBM fellow today and all that, right? So life takes on different turns, right? But so I actually I am from Madurai in Tamil Nadu, India, and that is where I was born and I grew up. Came from, I would say, an extremely modest financial upbringing is probably the best way to say it. We had a pretty close-knit family with 3 other siblings, brothers and 1 sister, right? 4 others. Maybe because of that modest financial upbringing, I think the value of education, right, was probably put into all of us right from the get-go. I mean, nothing surprising for a bunch of us that grew in those kinds of surroundings. Because I mean, to people like us, I mean, that was really the only path out of wherever you grew up in, right? So that is kind of the best way to do it. I was not a great student. I was a good student, but not necessarily a great student. But I would say until I got to my college, right? I had flashes of brilliance occasionally, but yeah, you grow up as a kid. Watching, movies here or playing cricket there or, being part of some extracurricular activities in school and so on and so forth. So I think it probably my worldviews and maybe a little bit more of awakening, not surprisingly probably happened during my college time, right? In my late first year, second year, third year time frame. So, and in a sense, I mean, that's probably, even at the time, I would say I was an introvert that, kind of flourished during the college time frame by being part of debate clubs and quiz shows and, things of the nature, right? So I would say a lot of that, if there was self-assurance, around me probably came from some of those kinds of experiences, right?
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, that's probably the initial intro, and we can go from there because that's a lot to say eventually. So yeah,
absolutely, yeah. Was there any particular influence, role model, or anybody that you were looking up when you were a kid, or saying that, okay, this is the type of education that I want, or anything like that?
I don't know if it's like that from a business sphere. I can't be that sure. I mean, you obviously grew up. I grew up in a place. I came from Madurai, so the TVS family was a big deal, right? So you kind of looked up to them, and kind of the way they grew up, and the business world that they grew up in, so on and so forth. But I can't honestly say that they were an inspiration in that sense, right? Nothing about them. I mean, they were actually a great family. It's just that I don't think I was smart enough to connect those dots, right?
Yeah.
I would say in some sense, I was probably, shaped more by, I would say social and cultural, things more than, business and educational things, if you want to put it that way. Like, for example, for some oddball reason, I got into the Gandhi thing, Madurai, in fact, has a Gandhi museum. And for some reason, I had this fascination with Gandhi right from childhood, going to the museum quite a bit and learning about him and all that, right? And then we had this really brilliant outpost of a library from Madurai Kamaraj University that was pretty close to where I used to live. And my brother and I used to, just frequent that. We were like one of the very few people that even frequented that. Most people didn't even know it existed, right? So we used to watch, they had all these little, documentaries and nature shows and all that, about really, movies and other things that are made in the West, right? Mm-hmm. And you start watching them, you literally be the only guy sitting in this little cubbyhole of a theater and watching that, and reading a lot of books, that both fiction and nonfiction came along the way. So I think it's more of maybe an independent, worldview that probably got shaped in me. That eventually, I mean, I can assure you this much, that I don't think I knew these things at the time. Mm-hmm. Looking back at those things, I feel like these things, really had a lot of influence on me, right?
That's great. There are certain things that are foundational and formative, but you don't identify it when you're going through that passage.
Oh my God, yeah, no way. Yeah. I mean, I wish I could tell you or anybody that, oh my goodness, I knew exactly what I was doing at the time, right? I think you just lived. That's all you're doing.
Sure. So, what made you choose to immigrate? Right? Tell us your life of the decision to come to out of India and your life as a new immigrant.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in some ways, it is I guess it was preordained to some extent, right? In the sense of, given the kind of situation that I grew up in, we needed to find a place that got us the best path to, career growth and financial growth and everything, right? So that was definitely a motivation. Interestingly, earlier point about, influence and so on. When I was in college, I actually wanted to be an astrophysicist or a nuclear physicist, right? So, but, I had to give up on those dreams because, I couldn't afford to, get to, I guess, postgraduate degree at the time. So I just had to find the first job that I had to get. And that first job was, just a pathway into whatever I could get. I was there for like 8 months. And, it's a conversation with me and my brother, who was just to this day is an inspiration to me, right? I mean, we're talking back in the 80s, right? I mean, at those days, computers in India, right? It's a big deal, but not a big deal, right? It's like not necessarily widespread, right? So it is just about growing. And so one ad led to me joining, writing this entrance exam where 10,000 people wrote this exam and 80 people get selected type thing, right? So mm-hmm. it's one of those things with the CMC. And I think, getting into computers at that young age, and eventually the thing that fascinated me then, and I would say still fascinates me even now, is the only common language to some extent worldwide is, it's the same when you're doing COBOL or whether you're doing, C++ or whether you're doing, these days Python, it is exactly the same thing regardless of where you are, right? I mean, it's maybe the one universal language, right? Mm-hmm. So in that sense, I think, you have this mental connection that, the systems you're using, I grew up with IBM even then, right? Or Unix or any of these things that it's like you kind of trace the innovations back, and the United States always was kind of in the middle of it, right? Either it got invented there or it matured there, right? It's one of those kinds of things.
Sure.
So I think it is just and to my earlier point about the fact that I grew up in this kind of a librarious environment, if I can call them that where I was exposed to a lot of this Western knowledge bases, right? I think that is probably my fascination about, just wanting to go somewhere, right? So I think it was just again, nothing planned. I think it just happened, right? I mean, the opportunity came, it's part of the computer stuff. Actually, it's interesting. The 80 people that joined, I think every one of those 80 people ended up in the West, right? Right around the time frame. So it was just a natural thing at the time, and nobody ever thought of that as a unusual activity. It was just the next step for you, right? That's how it was, right? So
we covered the reasons why we came to US, right? So tell us your life as a new immigrant and what helped you settle down in US.
I mean, you're talking about, what was I? I was like 22 years old at the time, I think. I'm trying to think back. Context matters, right? I mean, I came from probably one of the most conservative, towns on all of this southern India, right, in Madurai. Very traditional, very old. I mean, we were exposed to certain things. I mean, my first time out of Madurai was really for the job in CMC, right? When I was in Hyderabad. And so beyond those two experiences, I really didn't have, much of, even within India, I didn't have a lot of, I have traveled here, traveled there. So I experienced life, right, so to speak. So in that sense, the first plane ride, right, into the US, that was my first plane trip, really, to be honest, I think. So I mean, it was all like literally night and day, right? I mean, in terms of the surface level, viewpoint that you get, from society, from one society to another society, one culture to another culture. I think that exposes you to both the positives and interesting things, right? So you form certain hypotheses when you grow up, and then you are tested on these hypotheses, get tested, right? In a sense, I mean, is it really real, right? So on. I mean, life, you knew of life in the US through, what you watch in these movies or watching these documentaries or read about them, whatnot, right? You haven't lived the life, right?
Yeah.
So you kind of break that two-dimensional surface view into something that's much more rich and contextual and very three-dimensional. And to me, that is the fascination, right? I mean, it's interesting because I have the same feeling that my nephew, who came a few years ago to visit, we both had the exact same expression, right? Wow, we had seen a lot of green, right? There's a lot of greenery around us, right? I mean, it's like it's like things like that, right? I mean, I think there was life, I would say materialistic things, cultural things. I would say the people were very embracive, right? I mean, I'm not sure how experiences were for others, to be honest with you, but I never actually felt, out of place, right? I mean, to me, it was almost like this was literally the right place for me, and I just happened to, be a cog in the wheel that just this Lego puzzle just fit for me perfectly, right? So that's how it actually felt for me. So.
But you came here to do masters, right? Is that?
No, actually, I came to work. I actually came to, Oh, I'm sorry. I should have mentioned that. No, I actually came to work because it was at CMC. Then we quit, and then it's a bunch of people. They get mentioned. We all, at various points in that late 80s, all made a beeline to the United States, right? So I actually came here to work in the usual, the H-1 visa type models. And then when I settled here, then I, did my master's part-time, right? So I joined, I did Penn State in the early 90s, right? So that's when I did that. So,
That's fascinating because
Yeah.
when you came to US, where did you go? Which city?
I went to Florida.
Okay.
My first place was Dunedin, the Tampa Bay area, St. Petersburg, Clearwater, Dunedin. Absolutely gorgeous. To this day, in fact, it's interesting. My wife and my daughter and I actually, went there a few years ago just to see how the place was. Right? I mean, you haven't been there in ages, and it's just absolutely beautiful, right? Yeah, so that was my first time there, and those days, you shunt from, I guess, consulting gig to consulting gig, right? So I was in a year in Florida. I spent some time in St. Louis. I spent time in Minneapolis. I spent time in Detroit, in places like that. So I was kind of living in different parts of the world of the country. Before I ended up in Pennsylvania, in Harrisburg, Pennselsylvania, right? Which is where I actually began my master's part time, right? So yeah.
Okay, because I've heard stories of people who came here to work, right?
Mm-hmm.
They have a little bit of a tough time being embraced by the people because they work, and then outside of work it's harder to assimilate, etc. But people who came to do masters, they have this 2-year time that they can get adjusted before they get released out of of that, right? But tell me more, because this is
my guess is, it is probably, there's a gradation there, right? I mean, that's the way I would look at it, right? I don't know if it's black and white, but it's maybe a bit more gradation. I came with a bunch of other Indian origin colleagues, right? That we were all first time to the US, and so we all had to find our way, right? Type thing. So we roomed together and all that, just like being in a dorm in the college, except that we were just in an apartment somewhere, right? But like I said, I think in a sense the community around us, I mean the Indian community, it's one of those things, right? So you there are 10 people, and 3 or 4 of us were new, but the other 7 were already living. That is the second or third stint for them in the US, right?
Sure.
So they were helping us quite a bit, right? Assimilate. So the community really helped each other out. And to my other point about work, I mean, you go to work, and they were just, I mean, the colleagues at work were, I can't, I didn't have a bad day, right? Ever, right? It's one of the best things about there, because they were very embracive, they were very curious, they're very inquisitive, they're very helpful, right? I mean, they're just generous people, right?
Yeah.
In terms of, they kind of understood that, these are people who just came from another country, and they were just very generous with, offering assistance, whether it's around, hey, this is how life in the US is, helping with the driver license, helping with pop culture, you name it, right? Administrative trivia. I mean, it was just I just remember like just lots of just water cooler type conversations with a bunch of these people right back then, right? That really kind of helped you. So I never felt out of place, to be honest with you, in the sense of maybe that made my assimilation much easier than others. But, for me, I mean, when I compare it to the colleagues that I hung out with, I probably found it a little bit easier than others, but it was not that big a difference, right? To be honest with you. So, yeah.
Sure. It reminds me of a colleague in India. I used to work in a different company. That guy had a fascination with movies made in New York, right? But he grew up, he's in Hyderabad. So when he came here, and so his coworkers, like in the New York office, would take him in different places of New York and show him those buildings where those was picturized, and that was like a big deal for him. He used to go on those weekend trips just to check those marks, and he used to take pictures. He's a very good photographer too. So, but that's a way of assimilation,
Yeah. No, I think I mean that's so to the point about immigrant and cultural. I think the 2-dimensional view that people have in general of any place, right? When you have a 2-dimensional view, and then you go beneath the surface, and you find that people are just people, right? Yeah. It's the same. We all have similar aspirations, similar experiences. similar kind of goods and bads in ourselves. So the humanity just becomes much more common, right? I mean, that's really what ends up being. I truly maybe I'm an exception or a minority to maybe in some say, but I actually had a pretty reasonable and a very joyful period of assimilation in the US, right? So yeah.
This is to talk about your first job and career progression, etc. We did talk a little bit about it, but how was the experience of it, right?
So my first job, I mean, technically was actually a bank, right? I was a teller in a bank for 8 months, but that's when I mentioned that, it was something I had to take. So I took it, right? Just to get the initial money. But soon, after this entrance exam and whatnot, I mean, it's funny, right? Because I joined CMC. I'll tell you, I mean, my 3 years at CMC were probably the best formative years I have ever, I think I've been pretty fortunate in that regard, right? Because number one, CMC is pretty regimented about, teaching you things, right? So, we all were pretty okay, IQ wise, but we didn't know a lick about computing, right? So they, in fact, I didn't even know how to use a typewriter. So, those are the days you sit in front of a keyboard and start typing, and I had no idea how to use a keyboard, right? So we did a 4-month boot camp, where they taught you everything, right? At those days, I'm talking back in the 80s. So yeah, you had 5 days of COBOL, PL1, you had Pascal, you had, C, you had systems, analysis and engineering, and they even taught you how to communicate, right? I mean, we had actually mini debate competitions and whatnot, which interestingly was very helpful for me given my college experience, right? Things like that. So it was, they really crafted you into this real, I mean, obviously they did the best they could back in the mid 80s. I mean, for a public sector, company, they were an autonomous company, on the, of the government of India, but they're public sector. And then eventually I realized that they were actually the remnants of IBM, right? So when IBM left India, the company that got created and was actually CMC, right?
I see.
So the IBM culture was actually paramount in the company, and they were actually back in the, I mean, can you imagine back in the 80s, we were maybe forget about private sector, right? I mean, we were probably one of the very few companies that had a cubicle, kind of layout in an office, no rooms, none of that. The managing director was sitting on the same floor with us in a slightly larger cubicle by the corner. That's about it, right?
Yeah.
It was like a very open culture. And I had some great mentors. I think the two guys that, I mean, I figured out that I was actually pretty good at programming, right? I mean, it's something, I didn't know this before, but I was actually pretty meticulous, and it's we did mainframe programming those days, and the mainframe was rented, right? It was time sliced across the city of Hyderabad, right, to everybody. So which meant you write a program, you were allowed 3 compiles, right? So which meant that you had to do a lot of static testing ahead of time. You had to literally make sure that the program worked before you actually. It was punch card days, and so everything mattered. So yeah, I mean, I learned programming the right way, right? I mean, again, it's all retrospect, right? I mean, when eventually I figured out that I'm actually a pretty good programmer because of the fact that the way I learned it, and it was, you made sure that you tested things before you wrote anything, right? I mean, I was actually doing, in some strange way, test-driven development, I guess 35 years ago, without even knowing I was doing TDD, right? So things like that. So yeah, it was the first job of 3 years doing, mega systems, right? I mean, doing, I think the Andhra Pradesh, road transport corporations, whatever their entire vehicle management system, right? Things of the nature. I mean, it's all like mega turnkey systems we were doing. So I just learned right from the get-go. I was not doing small things, right? I was actually doing big systems, big programs and so on and so forth. So I think I was pretty lucky that way. So
these stories are very fascinating for me because it's also defining a person's career and leadership, but it's also the defining days of beginning of IT.
Yeah.
Right. moving from large mainframes to personal computers, but also different kinds of programming beyond academics, right? So it's really fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. You did mention about mentors, right? Can you tell us more on that? Like, basically, is there a motivating person or a boss or a professor? Like, what is that? How did that mentoring come into your life, and how did it help you?
Yeah, and again, Prasad, this is like, I'm connecting dots now, right? I mean, these are things that you didn't know at the time you experienced them, that somebody is actually mentoring you, right? It's one of those things. I didn't even know what the word mentoring meant, right? I didn't know such a word existed, back in those days. I mean, I did, but you kind of look up to, certain people inspire you, right? Through their behavior. I guess that's how to say it, right? So I did have a professor, Dr. KRB, in when I was doing physics in Majora College, and he took a liking to me, so to speak. I was actually, I was pretty bad in a lot of subjects, but I was pretty okay in physics, right? So I was actually college first in physics. So in a sense, we had a pretty good relationship, and he taught a lot, right? He actually came from the West. He studied in the US and came back to India to teach. So yeah, I mean, he was just the way he conducted himself, how he treated his students, how he treated others, how the knowledge base that he had, right? I mean, so he inspired through knowledge and behavior, right? So that kind of, stood with me, right? As opposed to being very hierarchical. And then these, in CMC, there are two gentlemen that were, I was just soaking their knowledge, right? I mean, they were just so brilliant, and they were very patient again, in teaching, right? So they would never scold you. They would actually just point out the fact that, hey, you know what, this is another way to do it, right? Type thing. Mm-hmm. So it was just, so I think that was an indelible experience with me. And then when I was I wouldn't say mid-career, but when maybe in my early 90s, when I was doing consulting, I had this, and maybe in the 5th or 6th year of my career, I would say that's probably the inflection point that changed the course of where I went, right? Because prior to that, I mean, I started in the mainframe, era, and then, the world quickly was changing under our feet. The client server, inflection point came in, right? And you had to scramble to go learn new technology, right? Because literally it was something new. Like Power Builder was a big deal back in those late 80s, early 90 timeframe, right? Mm-hmm. And then, before we knew it, it was object-oriented, right? And before we knew it, it was like, it's all like, inflection point after inflection point. So back in the 5th or 6th year of one of my other consultant, he was a senior consultant, a really good guy. I mean, he's the one that kind of gave me the viewpoint that, technology will change tremendously, right? In the sense of, whether it's COBOL today, C tomorrow, C++ the following day, and now it's Python, the Go, and etc. I mean, it just keeps changing, right? In fact, it's changing much faster. You can be in the rat race of chasing after it, or you can really understand the purpose of technology and really try to solve problems, right? And so in a sense, that is what I would say, made me go from, being a lifelong developer in the core sense of the word to someone who's actually a systems designer and an architect, right? So in a sense, the transition, probably happened at the time. I would say. So there are some early formative experiences like that. And obviously then, in a sense, over a period of time, it's just been other people that have come in various little ways. But I would say these initial individuals had a lot to do with how I grew, right? So, yeah.